Today, we're delving into a tale where the past was more than a distant presence. Next door at Scamperton, a woman believed she had left her betrayed life behind, her secret hidden from prying eyes. However, her sense of security was shattered when a new neighbor showed up and began to observe her every action, revealing a truth that was more horrifying than anything she had ever imagined. Kira Thompson seems to be a rock-solid, successful person in 2018. In Raleigh, North Carolina, she was a real estate agent, and she and her husband, Caleb Thompson, lived in a large house with 2 stories located in the Bedford at Falls River suburban area. For what their friends and neighbors could tell, their marriage had been going strong for almost a decade. At 36 years old, Caleb was already a successful entrepreneur with a slew of businesses under his belt. The 32-year-old Kira had established herself as a trustworthy expert in the cutthroat real estate industry. The Thompsons were burdened by financial distress. As a result of Caleb's reckless financial decisions, the once prosperous household started to go through stress and anxiety. As a result of his emotional withdrawal, Caleb spent a lot of time at work or on business trips. As a result of the emotional distance, Kira felt lonely and bitter. Because Caleb wouldn't listen to her or fix their issues, her discontentment escalated. While this was going on, Kira developed strong feelings for Greg Lawson, an associate at a realty firm. Greg, who was 34 years old, was charming and caring, and he gave Kira the emotional support that Caleb had stopped giving her. The dynamic between them in the workplace shifted. Relationship in late 2018, which resulted in an affair that brought Kira a renewed feeling of enthusiasm and validation. Her determination to escape her unhappy marriage grew in tandem with her growing attachment to Greg. Please tell us in the comments from where you're viewing this so that we can begin to dig further. Your feedback is much appreciated. If you want to be sure you don't miss any of our future videos, subscribe now. Kira started making plans to cut Caleb out of her life entirely instead of getting a divorce. The financial issues and the fresh start she craved would not be solved by a simple divorce. Kira chose to accuse Caleb of financial misdeeds after receiving subtle prodding and manipulation from Greg. Their combined efforts allowed them to discover potential weak points in Caleb's business transactions. Over the course of 2018 and into the beginning of 2019, Kira and Greg methodically hid information that could implicate Caleb in embezzlement. Documents were faked, financial records were altered, and organized tips to be sent anonymously to regulatory bodies. While secretly plotting Caleb's demise, Kira pretended to be worried about him. Nobody knew about her double life, not even her coworkers and relatives. Local police detained Caleb in April 2019 on charges of financial fraud and embezzlement, following an inquiry spurred by anonymous complaints. The investigation's evidence, much of it made up by Kira and Greg, clearly established Caleb's guilt. Upon completion of following a brief trial, Caleb was found guilty and handed a 20-year prison term. Although the evidence seemed overwhelming, he persisted in claiming his innocence. As a result of her husband Caleb's conviction, Kira played the role of a grieving wife trying to deal with the fallout. Even while she plotted her next move behind closed doors, she kept her job and kept up appearances in the community. In December 2020, prison officials announced Caleb's death, which occurred around 1 year after he had been incarcerated. Was incarcerated at North Carolina's Nash Correctional Institution when he was involved in a violent confrontation with another inmate. Official records indicate that Caleb was declared deceased upon arrival at the scene. The altercation allegedly left his body badly wounded, and a closed casket burial was held not long after. The community received the news of Caleb's death with little suspicion. The occurrence did not seem remarkable considering his conviction and the unstable atmosphere of the prison system. This occasion signified the farewell to her previous life. Following the receipt of her $500,000 life insurance claim, she and Greg resumed their lives as before. Kira bought a house in the adjacent Wakefield plantation development and sold her Bedford house within 6 months. Under the pretext of wanting a new beginning, she and Greg secretly tied the knot in early 2021. On the surface, it seemed like Kira had managed to put her life back together following the disaster. But underlying it all, the burden of her acts and the remorse she had yet to overcome were the foundation for the ensuing disintegration. Kira Thompson wasted no time in getting her life back together after the official announcement of Caleb Thompson's death in December 2020. A modest civil ceremony took place at the Wake County Courthouse in March 2021 to legally marry Greg Lawson. There was no great ceremony for the marriage, according to public documents. Kira and Greg bought a house on Appleton Way in the Wakefield Plantation area, which is fewer than 3 miles from their wedding. She lived in before Caleb. Renovating their new home was a major investment for the couple. Raleigh City Building Permits dated mid-2021 reveal a home office extension, updated cooking facilities, and a larger backyard entertaining space, among other interior renovations. Kira and Greg started throwing parties in the fall of that year, trying to show their friends, neighbors, and coworkers that they were a happy, successful couple. The career path that Kira took maintained their level throughout this period. To avoid any links with the people involved in Caleb's public fall, she kept working as a real estate agent, but with a different agency. Kira invested in marketing initiatives and personal branding efforts using some of Caleb's life insurance payout, according to financial records acquired later in the investigation. From the outside looking in, it seemed like she had triumphed over a personal tragedy and started again. Nevertheless, assessments of mental health performed. Kira's personal struggles with ongoing guilt and worry were exposed after her subsequent incarceration. Changes in her personality were noted in interviews with intimate acquaintances. Every now and then, mood changes increased irritation and downtime. In private, Kira felt the weight of her previous acts, despite her confident public persona. A newborn daughter had joined Kira and Greg's family in early 2022, further cementing the picture of a resilient family overcoming adversity. News of the birth spread quickly, published in real estate periodicals and on social media to commemorate Kira's return to work after maternity leave. From all accounts, the Thompsons, now known as the Lawsons, had moved on from their troubled past. A new neighbor took up residence in the empty lot next to Kira and Greg's house in February 2022. The home was bought by 35-year-old Michael Harris in his own name. Michael, who was characterized by his neighbors as reticent and quiet, spent most of his time alone, concentrating on small-scale house renovations and regular upkeep tasks. Michael was unnoticed by Kira at first. Michael did not make any overt efforts to engage with Kira or Greg in his initial months in the community, according to surveillance logs and witness testimony gathered from the neighborhood. But by 2022 summer, Kira started to notice Michael more and more. She told a friend in passing that she felt watched, but she brushed it off as the normal postpartum hormones, anxiety. Incidents around the Lawson household became harder to disregard, despite her explanations. On multiple occasions, Kira found Michael in his yard at strange hours, usually standing where he could see their house clearly. She noticed him crossing the street on several occasions, as if he were watching her former house, the one she had lived in with Caleb, which had sat empty and unsold for some time. Several small but disturbing things happened to Kira around this period. Unidentified cars would park on her street from time to time, she said, and she also had trouble finding things around the house and getting voicemails in the middle of the night. Even though there was no concrete proof connecting these problems to Michael, Kira's anxiety intensified. There was no written agreement, but records reveal that Kira approached a private security firm in August 2022 with an informal request to install more cameras around her property. Nobody in the area listened to her worries, and she did not appear to have pursued any official forms of protection during that period. Later conversations with Kira revealed that the persistent assumption that a component of her past may resurface at some point during this time added to her concerns. On the surface, she treated Michael like any other unusual neighbor, but her actions betrayed a growing fear that her meticulously restored existence was more precarious than it seemed. Kira Lawson's anxiety had intensified by the time summer 2022 came to a close, in the midst of ongoing paranoia. She had grown more and more worried by Michael Harris's presence in her neighborhood, according to official interviews and psychological assessments performed after his arrest. At the time, witnesses said that Kira's clumsy and frequently disoriented demeanor was due to the stress of juggling her professional and familial responsibilities. The true reason, however, was uncovered by the investigation's internal documents and statements. Kira's distress about the fact that her history was vulnerable to disclosure. The behavior of Michael was increasingly noticeable during the month of September 2022. He was seen sitting on his porch, staring at the old Thompson house, and staying there late into the night, according to surveillance footage and eyewitness account from the neighborhood. Despite Michael's lack of overt aggression, some witnesses regarded him as unnerving and vigilant. In many public places throughout Raleigh, Kira ran into Michael more than once. Based on what she said thereafter, the local coffee shop, grocery store, and pharmacy were all places where people crossed paths. Michael pretended to be harmless each time, but Kira began to worry that someone was following her because of how close he was. A continual undercurrent of tension was created, she saw, by his habit of standing around without participating. There was an occurrence that made Kira's anxieties worse in the afternoon of October 4th, 2022. As she toiled away in her backyard garden, she beheld Michael, frozen in place across the street, intent, fixated on the deserted home that she and Caleb had shared. Subsequently, security footage obtained from a neighbor's house camera verified Michael's prolonged presence at that spot. Kira took his actions as a subtle accusation, even though he didn't try to approach. Forensic examination of their devices yielded internal messages between Kira and Greg, which showed that she started to voice grave worries regarding Michael. From October 6th until the 10th, she sent a string of text messages in which talked about how it felt to be attacked and exposed. With the possibility that Caleb's death was staged, she wondered if Michael had any ties to the man. Kira changed her habits every day because she was afraid someone would find out. She cut down on her time spent outdoors and began to drive in different patterns, all in an effort to avoid Michael. Additionally, she informed her clients that she was temporarily unable to work due to family difficulties. According to public documents, her real estate has diminished significantly. Performance throughout that time. Even though Kira was becoming more and more anxious, she chose not to contact the police or see an attorney. According to interviews with her closest friends, she was afraid that an inquiry into Michael's actions may reveal her own criminal history if she was caught red-handed. Michael kept up his covert surveillance without breaking any laws. His subsequent testimony analysis shown that he kept a low profile on purpose, knowing full well that he and Caleb were implementing a wider strategy, and taking forceful action could jeopardize it. Things took a turn for the worst in late October when Kira started getting messages from unknown senders. The incident began with small, seemingly harmless notes that were left at her porch and in her mailbox. The messages had words such, "I see you and you can't hide." Later on, fingerprint and handwriting studies connected these notes to Michael, even though they were constructed to avoid direct threats. The effect on Kira's mental health was significant. She began to distrust everyone, including Greg, and suffered from insomnia and panic episodes. Her private journal writings, which were analyzed by forensic experts, express her dread that Caleb was alive and plotting her demise. In spite of Greg's assurances, Kira's behavior became more and more unpredictable. At night, she would pace the driveway, check the locks multiple times, and even confront delivery people she didn't know, according to her neighbors. A neighbor mentioned an episode in which Kira falsely implicated a nearby adolescent in an attempt to spy on her. According to Michael's strategy, which is detailed in the final case file, he planned to emotionally destabilize Kira by playing on her guilt and paranoia. The psychological fissures in Kira's well-preserved new existence were exposed by his persistent, non-confrontational presence. There was a tipping point in Kira Lawson's mental health in November 2022. Psychiatric assessments and investigative investigations subsequently showed that her Michael Harris's persistent presence had intensified her paranoia, which had progressed into overwhelming dread and panic. After a late afternoon appointment on November 14th, 2022, Kira came home to discover a handwritten message in her mailbox. Official evidence gathered at the scene indicated that the note was plainly worded and said, "I know what you did." Subsequent fingerprint analysis, however, disproved any suggestion of gloves being used. According to forensic document analysis, the information typeface to a typical model of home printer, but the origin could not be easily determined. Immediate and serious consequences ensued from the note. Neighbors and Greg Lawson's subsequent testimony both noted a marked shift in Kira's conduct. She started acting withdrawn and upset, and she started saying she was afraid someone was watching her. The nebulous threat provided no concrete proof to act upon, notwithstanding her early suspicions about Michael. The note's arrival was followed by a string of unknown callers started ringing. The official phone records that were retrieved later on in the investigation revealed that Kira's personal cell phone had multiple calls from unknown numbers. "When I first started making calls, there was complete dead air." However, Kira did not immediately report the encounter to police enforcement, but she noted it in a 911 log after receiving a call on November 20th from a voice that sounded uncannily familiar and said, "You can't hide forever." Later on, when searching her home, her secret journal was found. She made it clear in the entry from November 21st that she thought Caleb might have been the one speaking. A severe mental breakdown ensued upon the awareness that Caleb might be alive and pursuing her. At this time, Kira's paranoia reached a delusional level, according to Greg Lawson's testimony. She insisted on monitoring the security systems several times nightly, suspected Greg of plotting against her, and started storing up on necessities as if getting ready for a protracted siege. Narratives from Kira's neighbors provided more information on her worsening health. Late at night, she would pace outdoors, talk to herself, and check her car for evidence of tampering, according to many witnesses. Surveillance footage from neighboring homes verified these actions. Greg begged Kira to see a doctor, but she still wouldn't budge. As her messages were analyzed forensically, she was terrified that having any kind of conversation with the police or doctors would bring light to her criminal history. She was open to additional psychological manipulation because she chose to be alone. Michael Harris kept a low profile but constant presence as he continued his monitoring. He allegedly used subtle tactics meant to make Kira more unstable, rather than resorting to direct confrontation, as he testified under oath later on. Anonymously posing in public places where Kira could see him and planning. Triggers for her remorse. Again, Kira had a head-on collision that exacerbated her breakdown on November 25th, 2022. She thought she caught a glimpse of Caleb observing her from across the parking lot while she shopped at a nearby supermarket. Upon reviewing the store's security footage during the investigation, it was determined that Caleb was not physically present. The experts agreed that Kira's encounter was most likely a hallucination brought on by her stress, which was made worse by her mounting guilt and anxiety. Over the subsequent days, Kira started to publicly confide in her loved ones about her terror at the thought that Caleb was still alive. But since there was no hard proof, her worries were written off as the result of old emotional wounds. As his testimony shows, Greg, who was also feeling the effects of mounting stress, thought about getting some outside assistance, but decided to emotionally separate himself instead. Fear transformed into desperation for Kira by early December 2022. She stopped going to work events altogether and rarely left the house. Recovered private emails from her account showed that she investigated information on legal resources for restarting wrongful death cases and safeguards against harassment. Nevertheless, she never formally lodged any grievances. On December 8th, Kira discovered yet another anonymous note in her mailbox, which escalated the stress. The date of December 15th, 2022 was this time included in the note. There was no further message attached. There were no fingerprints this time either, and the note paper was from the same batch as the last correspondence, according to the forensic evidence. When early September 2022 rolls around, Kira Thompson's meticulously built. All hell broke loose. She was already unnerved by the first anonymous note, but the second one made it crystal clear. Abandoned once more in her mailbox, this time with no trace of its origin. Included in this message were multiple images. Rather than in a hospital or hiding, the photos revealed a fairly normal life for Caleb Thompson. The photos showed him in a variety of settings, including a grocery store, a cafe, and a park trail. Dates and timestamps on the images captured during the previous few months, proving he had indeed been alive for a while. Kira freaked out the moment she got the photos. Everything she had believed for the last 3 years was shattered by the shock of seeing Caleb alive. She was now perilously close to having her role in framing Caleb uncovered, and the insurance claim she had obtained based on his supposed death was also bogus. Kira reacted instantly. Looking through her phone, she tried to find any missed calls, any messages via text that would clarify the issue, but there was none. She was overwhelmed by the notion that Caleb might have been planning revenge against her. Kira was startled to get a knock at her home within the first hour of discovering the images. Michael stood on her front doorstep, and she recognized him through the peephole. However, he had company. He was flanked by 2 uniformed police officers. They introduced themselves as soon as Kira opened the door and told her she was being held without bail. Attempts at murder, conspiracy, and insurance fraud were among the charges. Kira was shackled and put in the rear of a police cruiser as she stared in disbelief at what was happening around her. After the fact, investigators verified that Michael was more than just a neighbor. For almost 3 years, he had coordinated closely with Caleb Thompson and the police. Caleb had resolved not to vanish without a trace following his unjust incarceration. But after he got out of jail, cooperating with police to collect indisputable evidence against Kira, he had agreed to keep the specifics secret throughout the early stages of the investigation. A controlled plot involving certain prisons' officers and law enforcement officials had planned Caleb's staged death in jail so that Kira would be brought to justice without being alerted too soon. Michael, posing as someone else, had relocated to the area in early 2020, not long after Caleb's. The public was informed about the reported demise. It was his job to keep an eye on Kira covertly, recorded her habits and spending habits to find out whether she was deceitful with her insurance money and if she would show any signs that she knew Caleb was alive. Michael recorded several times where Kira did things that made her feel guilty, such as making big withdrawals of money, communicating suspiciously with Greg Hastings, and admitting things in private conversations. Kira was found guilty after a trail of evidence that included audio recordings of her phone conversations, bank records that proved she had spent insurance money fraudulently, and the testimonies of several witnesses who knew about her deceit. Crucially, the inquiry showed that Greg Hastings had been helping the authorities out by the middle of 2022, giving further evidence to back up his claims in return for a lighter sentence for his part in the case. Kira was apprehended for no apparent reason, but something that Caleb and the police had been plotting for months. The timing of the photo release and the confrontation was meticulously planned by the authorities to catch Kira off surprise, minimizing the chances of her escaping or destroying evidence. After her arrest, Kira was interviewed multiple times. At first, she disputed the accusations, but later, she revealed contradictions that lent credence to the prosecution's case. In September 2022, Kira Thompson was arrested, precipitating a quick end, exposing her well-concealed transgressions to the public. Prosecutors detailed the entire scheme that she and Greg Hastings had hatched within days of her arrest. According to the inquiry, Michael Carson, who pretended to be her peaceful neighbor, had been collaborating with Caleb Thompson and the police for a long time, methodically gathering information that would bring Kira down. Authorities provided a chronology of Kira's activities during the investigation. Begin with the 2019 erroneous conviction of Caleb and the deceptive scheme that led to it. Kira had influenced Caleb into unwittingly incriminating himself in a non-existent embezzlement operation, planted fake evidence, and intentionally forged financial documents, according to the evidence. The plot to cut Caleb out of Kira's life and give her access to their combined assets and insurance benefits was well thought out, according to interviews with former co-workers, including Greg Hastings, free from legal challenge. In 2020, as news of Caleb's staged death spread, Kira wasted no time in completing her insurance claims and collected more than $500,000 in life insurance payouts. She and Greg reportedly bought a house in Raleigh's North Hills area, put some money into it, and then started a new life together with the money. Kira showed no symptoms of sadness during this time, according to the investigators. On the contrary, her financial dealings demonstrated a deliberate attempt to separate herself from her history, in order to create a fresh persona without any repercussions. The prosecution's case against Kira was extensive and compelling during the trial. Important pieces of evidence were witness statements from others who lived in the area or worked with Caleb in the years after his death, financial documents that detailed the fake insurance claims, and audio recordings of Kira and Greg discussing the illegal financial schemes. Greg Hastings' testimony was the most devastating. As part of the plea bargain, Greg went into great detail about how he and Kira exploited Caleb, orchestrated the fabrication of evidence, and, in the end, rejoiced over Caleb's expulsion from their life. The role that Greg played in helping the authorities was crucial. He came clean about Kira's role as the conspiracy's mastermind, saying that she had used her influence in the real estate sector to fabricate paperwork and launder funds via investments in real estate. According to his testimony, he first thought Kira's plot was only a way out of her unhappy marriage, but he came to understand her true objectives as she orchestrated. News about Caleb's passing. Local and national media outlets covered the trial daily, drawing major attention to the court proceedings. Once sympathetic to the bereaved widow, the public swiftly turned against Kira when the full depth of her deceit became apparent. The journalistic community portrayed her as someone who put financial gain and personal freedom ahead of human life and justice by pointing out how deliberate her actions were. The presiding court highlighted Kira's callousness and the seriousness of her actions during sentencing. Her deeds included permeation. Kira Thompson received a 25-year prison term for attempted murder, obstruction of justice, conspiracy, and insurance fraud in November 2022. Not only were her offenses serious, but her behavior with Caleb betrayed his trust, which was reflected in the sentence. Michael Carson and Caleb Thompson slipped out of the courtroom hand in hand as the trial ended. Although Caleb and Michael's friendship had naturally grown strained due to the strains caused by, both men conveyed a common feeling of fulfillment after carrying out an undercover operation for an entire year in complete secrecy. After being wrongfully imprisoned and thought dead, Caleb decided to pursue justice the right way instead of getting even. He was able to regain his independence and reputation as a result of this decision. The North Carolina Correctional Institution for Women in Raleigh is where Kira started serving her term. She kept a low profile, according to reports from inside the institution, and avoided encounters, and she seldom discusses her history. The hopeful real estate agent, who had labored for years to build a new life for herself, now faced decades in prison, cut off from the community she had fiercely battled to establish. Truth will eventually catch up with everyone.